Hello everyone, today we talk about the Tudor army dress. This is not a fully complete survey about early modern armies, trying to be concise, but sometimes looking at more unitary, at least, sometimes even less documented realities, right? With England we have enough information, and yet we will concentrate today prevalently on Henry VIII's army, still looking at the Elizabethan period as well, and looking at the especially in the first half of the 16th century, therefore, and the great change, at least in conceptions of what sorts of allegiances soldiers should be advertising in their garb. Right here we are after, of course, the War of the Roses, 1485, Henry VII, and we have the pretty, unitary reign of Henry VIII that changes a big deal. Things we would never actually discussed him, but surely this is a moment in which England still, in spite of its relative retirement fundamentally from the continent, military matters, still has, if not properly an updated army to the piece of continental developments, because the most imported, war horses, armor, artillery from the continent, right? But they were still keeping up with the continental developments, and thanks to the power displayed by Henry and the important military operations he waged. We'll have to talk about Tudor armies in general somewhere else. I think we made a bit about the Tudor militias. Here we will partly address the ones from the counties, and even today for their equipment. This is a time which therefore the English monarchy tries to concentrate, to centralize, to become the only true point of reference, especially over the great houses that had been decimated after the War of the Roses, and passing from this kind of more privatistic system to a sort of statal one, right? And at the beginning of this period, the white coat, even from before, was, say, associated firmly with the English soldier. Today, naturally, we talk about all the issue we repeat every time of the effort for homogenization, uniformity. Here we talk anachronistically of uniforms, at least in the modern sense, right, of the term. A degree of uniformity had always existed throughout all history at some level, right? It's just, we start talking especially about the second half of the 17th century as the moment in which, the true uniform is, which is improper as well, because aside from the fact that even today, even equipment is not fully, in production terms is standardized, but, even how soldiers go in combat is a matter sometimes of customization and personalization. Today we talk about dress, which is a different thing, but not even from the 17th century we actually have a full standardization. There's just, let's say, a satisfactory homogeneity due to the fact that the state now is centralizing the system of supplying production, and so on. So that's another thing. Here we're at the beginning of it, right? But still certain countries had preferential color in a sense, and in the case of England, the word white coat was almost interchangeable with the one of soldier, and a bit like the red coats later on, and these coats were commonly emblazoned with the traditional English field sign, that was the Red Cross of St. George, that since the 100 Years' War had began to appear as a sign of distinction, this on the surcoats, as the mark of the English soldier. So this symbol took on really a national meaning, because even foreign troops in English service could be turned out in white. For example, the 500 Landsknecht, who under the command of Flemish Captain Guyot had accompanied the force sent to Spain in 1511, right? These were dressed as whole relates, quote, all in white, which was cut so small that it could scarce hold together. And still they would maintain their outlandish style of dress as Germans, but it's meaningful that even a foreign trooper would be try to be standardized on that pattern. The accession to the throne of Henry VII in 1485 had also added new elements to the traditional English colours, because the traditional ones of the Tudor were green and white. Green could be added, therefore, to the latter colour to give a coat of the Tudor family livery colours. And for the first half of Henry VIII's reign, thus green and white coats were the most frequently mentioned type. And part of the reason for this is that the crown now was responsible for paying the coats of militia contingents, and therefore they were issuing this widespread, this color to make it widespread, right? And so-called coat money in this sense would, given that it was the crown paying for, would display the king's colors in practice. Some units under contract were also clad, as we've seen in the royal livery. One of the nobility that was naturally trying to maintain a bit more of of identity or autonomy because of their power. For example, Surrey's retinue at the Battle of Flodden Field was one such. The Earl of Northumberland's contingent that was shipped to France in the same year was another one. There is a detailed list of the clothing provided by Northumberland, and curiously, he combined the Tudor green and white of his men coats with his own red and black livery colours, which appeared on their hats, quivers, and flagstaffs. And he also added the cross of St. George and the Tudors, or perhaps the Lancastrian rose, and even the crescent badge of his own family, the Percys. So the actual uniform items at this point were usually in this period, to a coat and bonnet, right? Yeah, it was as few as it normally did, because most soldiers at that point would be equipped in civilian clothes, normally. It's interesting to note that both Surrey and Northumberland came from families that had much to gain by the display of loyalty to the ruling dynasty. And naturally, those were the colors that they were trying to represent. And other units were provided with coats of a variety of colors, right, bearing an equally wide variety of recognitions of marks. In 1511, the force sent to aid Margaret of Savoy in the Low Countries returned to England newly equipped by her in coats of red, yellow, green, and white. The yellow and red probably represented Margaret of Savoy livery colours. At Flodden Field, the contingent provided by the Stanley family wore coats emblazoned with badges of the Stanleys and of the bishopric of Ely, who was a Stanley, because the bishop at the time was a Stanley as well. And there is a poem close to the battle that describes these men thus, quote, every bairn that is a man had on his breast broidered fully fair, a foot on the fairest foal that ever flew on wing, with 3 crowns full clear of all pure gold. And there is a document of 1522 that shows how the king empowered the Earl of Shrewsbury to furnish the men of Shropshire and certain northern counties with liveries, badges, and tokens. And we don't know actually whether the livery in question was the king's one or the red and black of the earl. However, the important is the uniformity issued for these marks of recognition, and especially the badges seem actually to have been of the earls, because it was a silver talbot, anyhow. And the practice of small units being clad in their leaders' colors certainly survived late into the reign. Peter Carew, the captain of a 100-man company in Wallop's 1543 expeditionary force. These guys, according to Carew's biographer, were clothed and apparelled at Carew's charges all in black, and they were thus named the Black Band. The Carew's arms were 3 lions passant impale and sable. A much larger force was the London trained bands, that we have already seen in later times. Think about the English Civil War. Well, these were already, because of the wealth of the city and the broader capability of centralization of supplies, etc. Also the king's proximity kept sometimes very, very well for those time standards, for a militia standard especially. Their uniforms by 1539 are described in chronicles mostly, and we know from these that, with the exception of officers and officials, they were clothed in white, including their hose, which is more complete than the usual coat and headgear. And some had coats slashed to reveal red linings, while the meaner sort of people, according to one source, wore white cotton coats, quote, very curiously trimmed, with the arms of the city on front and back. Over time, during the reign of Henry VIII, the individuality of recognition marks was, however, decreasing in favor of more color and fields and signs uniformity. And in 1523, regulations governing what might be called the auxiliary services of the army stipulated that laborers had to wear a badge of spade or mattock. Carters were to have a badge of a horse comb or a red cross. By 1544, the regulations had become even more comprehensive. For the expedition to France, the battle and the rear guard were provided with coats of red, guarded yellow. The vanguard wore blue, guarded red. Details of the vanguard's coat were sent to the Count of Buren in order that he might clothe his own men correctly. And the source states, the colors of the ward where Mont de Bure shall serve are blue and red, the body of the garment blue, and a broad guard of 3 fingers broad red, and 1 of the sleeves. And there are figures depicted in engravings of the Cowdray House paintings that appear to be wearing uniform coats as well. In fact, there is a scene showing the departure of the king's ward from Calais. Well, cavalry as well as infantry are clothed in them. There is a set of regulations concerning the clothing of the vanguard, and it's stated that, quote, the right hose to be all red and the left to be blue, with 1 stripe of the 3 fingers broad of red upon the outside of his leg from the stock downwards. Also, the soldiers were to be issued to put their skull in or a sallet in. The same regulations place heavy restrictions on the use of badges that, as we've seen, constituted the more customizable aspect of allegiance, right, towards maybe a nobleman rather than his house and rather than the king and so on. It says, quote, "No gentleman nor other wear any manner of silk upon the guard of his coat, save only upon his left sleeve, and that no yeoman wear any manner of silk upon his said coat, nor no gentleman nor yeoman to wear any manner of badge." And a red cross was to be sewn to the uppermost garment as well. This whole issuing is very important in the history of English military costume, because before it really didn't appear in by this kind of standardization. That naturally we have to expect to have been very low overall. It's probable that blue, red, and yellow colors reflected the tinctures of the royal arms proper, while the purely dynastic connotations of the earlier green and white were, fundamentally abandoned over time. This is to be observed, for example, in the yeomen of the guard. They were probably the most standardized unit in terms of, of equipment. Those uniforms were changed from green and white to red in the middle of Henry VIII's reign. But only many years after, the English troops were issued with a universally accepted national uniform, and in Tudor's times, basically, they didn't come even close, right? But it's important still that what we see, with the red that is associated for first time, the new model army, etc. That was already something national, as you understand. The arms of England already displaying the red background, and so on. There are, we know at least of contingents dressed in the livery colors of their commanders, bearing their badges, only a few short years after Henry VIII's death at the latest. This is important. While the tradition of the white coat, as we will see, endured more. In 1545, Lord Russell wrote that the men of Dorset, Somerset, Devon, and Cornwall, whom he had mustered to face the threatened invasion, had only provided themselves with white coats at their own expense. Right, and contemporary sources still refer of soldiers as white coats, as we were saying at the beginning. For example, when the forces of Sir Thomas Wyatt marched to London to overthrow Queen Mary, both they and the London train bands wore white uniforms, as we have seen, and the only sign of distinction at that point was that the rebels, during their long march, had all their clothes, dirty in mud, essentially. That was the only way of recognizing them. There was at this time a bit of, already, for example, the difference with the Spanish that came to be intertwined with England first as theoretically as allies, eventually as enemies. It placed more emphasis, at least initially, on the heterogeneity of clothing, because it was supposed to boost the individuality of morale, but it was not a great formula. Actually, we made a video about the Spanish tercio uniforms, where we see actually that the Spanish went, through this process of uniformation, of course, as well. But that's extended on the 16th and 17th century. Today we stop just to the Tudors, so it's the 16th basically. The English in this regard, however, seem in their military service to have already, cleared the idea that uniformity was somewhat the future in some way. This is important because, I repeat it, at the time it was nothing like a proper uniformity as we intended in England over time, and this is even especially from Elizabethan times, where they strived to put a bit, to keep up a little bit more with the continental military developments that were, advancing. They were, compared to which the English were starting to lag behind. They would compensate basically just with Cromwell, right? This is very important in the history of England, but for reasons that now we can't discuss, but should discuss about the Tudor, the Stuarts policies that are very fascinating. I'm a great fan of the Stuarts, by the way. I must say, I love the Tudors as well, but they were simply trying to do different things, right? The Tudors were trying to cash, and there was still no real state. The Stuarts attempted that, right? They caused a revolution, but that still triggered fundamentally the creation of a real state and a real permanent army. As you know, it took time. But the problem was really about this. I mean, think about the Armada, all the threat posed to England, the fort. So militia was an important element in this because it was the traditional master form of in English, at least in terms of numbers, right? The most, the readily available, but not surely the best in terms of quality, but still it was supposed to work. And in this, the responsibility of county authorities was important because they were provided the money to raise with code and conduct, right? That is to say, they had to issue uniform codes to each draft of men who were called to serve. Also pay for their journey and conducting them to the place where the army was assembled. Then eventually, once they had joined the royal army, these levies would come onto the Queen's payroll. So the counties, however, do not seem to have had a fixed regulation for outfitting their militia. We just have some hints as far as I understand. For example, the troops raised in Essex in 1585 were given blue coats. That seems, as we will see, was also more common starting the second half of the 16th century than it seems. But for example, when Essex raised a body of light horse in 1590, they were issued with cassocks in friar's grey with 2 guards that are basically edging stripes of blue and yellow. Other countries seem to have stuck to a sort of uniform color scheme. It's just we don't have the explicit evidence for it. The most significant one is the one of Yorkshire, that in 1567 issued to its soldiers coats of light blue with 2 small laces, red caps, and buckskin jerkins. In 1575, Yorkshire light horse wore plaid coats, a skull or sallet covered with blue cloth, a blue coat, doublet and hose, and riding boots. In 1587, Yorkshire levies were turned out in cassocks and breeches of blue cloth lined yellow. We have other connections to the Yorkshire blue in here because, for example, the description of soldiers raised in Lancaster in 1577 describes pikemen wearing blue Yorkshire broadcloth, right? So this had apparently become famous around. And we just guess at this point that the blue broadcloth was a particular specialty of that county. And the description also adds that the pikeman's coat was to be decorated with 2 stripes of red and yellow broadcloth by way of a border. The vest, the doublet, was to be made of white Holmes fustian, and the breeches to be of pale blue kersey with 2 stripes of red or yellow cloth down the seams, 2 fingers broad with garters and points. So it's even kind of constructed or articulated. White kersey stockings and shoes with large ties completed the outfit, and arms were to be a corselet with gorget and headpiece. Right, and naturally there was the various English counties were not homogeneously equipping their militiamen in all their ways. Let's say the unlucky recruit would be issued with a coat and have to rely upon his own resources to provide the rest of his uniforms, right? And elsewhere, instead, was kind of more pride about the outfit and the various. Naturally, were differences also in the type of troopers. We have here other example. We have from 1553 Canterbury yellow, from 1556 reading blue coats with red crosses, crosses for debilment. The 1550s Surrey issued the demi-lances red cassock with double white guard. By 1558 London specifically, as we've seen, the white coats, but in this case slashed green with red crosses. Lancashire 1560s had archers equipped with a blue cassock, double white guard, red cap, buckskin and jerkin. Derby from the 1560s light blue, Stafford red. In 1576 Lancashire white cassocks with one red and one green lace. 1585 London red. In 1585 Essex pikemen equipped blue mandelion. As we will see now, is this kind of tabard-like garment worn at the time usually over armor. And 1587 Hertfordshire trained bands were issued red coats. 1588 Huntington, the infantry popping that is parrot green, trimmed with the colors of the captain of the company. That was Sir Henry Cromwell's company of horse. Straw collar trimmed with his colors. 1590 Canterbury red, 1596 London red, 1599 Essex russet coat and hose. The term coat here is also problematic sometimes because it can be used for a variety of different garments. As we have seen here, there were cassocks or cassocks, the mandelions or mandeville, the gallet gascoin or gallet gashins. Now, the mandelion was an overgarment which hung loosely from the shoulders, right? The side seams of the body and the inside seams of the sleeves were not stitched but buttoned together, so that they could be worn like a tabard, or let's say with the open sleeves left to hang loose. The gallet gascoin seems to have been a portmanteau version of the mandelion because it didn't have buttons, so basically the garment was held in place by tapes which tied under arms. Well, for the common soldier, breeches called Venetians, because they were supposedly from Venice in origin, were becoming the rule. And the Venetians hung from the waist and reached down just to below the knee and could be cut to a tight fit or to hang very full, right? They were much more practical than the enormous Pluderhosen style breeches, which were famous previous times. Officers also wore Venetians, but the curious trunk hose worn with canyons, so-called, still was an option. Also, this was an earlier form. This gave the effect of baggy breeches from the waist to the upper thigh, meeting tight-fitting shorts instead, extending down to just above the knee. And much of the equipment must have been produced for the specific occasion where the militia were called upon to serve, but there is no clear indication whether, for example, in the case of the trained bands, we know that they had to, they were issued these coats for the master, while they would fundamentally return them to a central store afterwards, but because London was better organized. See, there are other types, let's say, of coats of colors, especially used by the English troops. For example, blue seems to have been widely worn in spite of all. For Irish service, cassocks were usually to be of russet green or other so-called sad colors. Cavalry in Elizabethan times seem to have favored red, tawny, or orange colors. Border horse usually wore white, could wear blue bonnets like the Scots. And the English archers too often wore Scots caps, in fact, in red or blue over their helmets. And so was properly a sake of recognition, and cavalry helmets were likewise sometimes covered with red or party-colored caps. In all this, officers were usually distinguished from their men in this similar, fundamentally civilian kind of equipment, mostly by armament, like it had always been, historically, before modern times, for distinguishing actually the military for troopers. Consider at this time, armor is going down, right? So, except for the heavy cavalry that, still had this very heavy equipment, etc. Also, so officers were often equipped, usually sword, buckler, half-pike, or partisan. At least they were favored by officers, but mostly in their dress by rich clothing with silk and lace, gold or silver trim, decorated armor, and jewelry. Right, armor is still around for important amount of troops, but still, and that tells you how non-uniform the system of supplies and production usually was, right? But this would remain. I think we've seen it during even in the following centuries during the Civil War. It was a bit like the same in terms of differences between officers and soldiers. All right. So for now, we stop here. I just hope that you enjoyed this video. If you did, please share it. Otherwise, leave a like or subscribe to my channel if you're interested in my upcoming content. And for now, I thank you heartily for listening to me. I wish you a nice time and see you next time. Bye.